gathering records about their life, and trying to really chart out kind of what is this trajectory towards violence for this person? How do you go from being a baby to being a heinous murderer? And can we really spell out exactly what that pathway looks like?
Have you found anything similar in these variables between mass shooters and the people on death row back in New York City, New York State?
That's a good question. I haven't been asked that one before. Yes, certainly. One sister of a perpetrator described it really eloquently, where she said her brother went from saying, what's wrong with me, to saying, what's wrong with everybody else and whose fault is it? Right? It's like, it's the initial piece of it is this
Oh.
self-loathing, but then it becomes, this has to be someone's fault. So whose fault is it?
Dr. Peterson, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's talk about your research as a special investigator in New York City. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so I was in New York City. I was young, about 23, 24, 25, working for the New York Capitol Defender's Office, which was the public defender's office that only does death penalty cases in New York City. So all of our clients were facing the death penalty, and New York actually didn't use the death penalty a whole lot. So when they did use it, they were pretty sort of serious headline type murders. And it was my job to go to Rikers Island and meet our clients who were facing the death penalty and put together what we called biopsychosocial developmental life histories.
Wait, say
So
that again. Biopsycho. Say that again,
so
please.
biopsychosocial developmental life histories.
Wow. Okay.
So, and those were used to make the argument that the perpetrator should get life without parole instead of the death penalty. And so it was a lot of talking to these murderers, spending hours with them on Rikers Island, meeting their families, their, kindergarten teachers, their old neighbors, anybody we could find who would talk to us, gathering records about their life and trying to really chart out kind of what is this trajectory towards violence for this person? How do you go from being a baby to being a heinous murderer? And can we really spell out exactly what that pathway looks like?
Um, you spend hours with these murderers. What is that like? Like,
Yeah,
I mean, that's not a normal thing for an ordinary American, right?
no. You know, it was unremarkable in some ways. I think I went in
Oh,
thinking I'm going to go meet these heinous murderers, these
yeah.
animal actors, it's going to be terrifying. And it wasn't. You had to remind yourself that this person had committed a heinous murder. They
You
were
had to remind
likable.
yourself somehow in the conversation with them, they came out normal. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly weren't. They had really, every time you could see this life history leading up to this, right? A lot of them had serious mental health histories, really significant trauma histories, kind of horrific lives leading up to this point. Um, but you still saw the good in them. They still could make jokes. They still, it still felt like you were talking to a human being. And in many cases, I don't know, that's the thing that gave me the most hope in general, that these are the people who have done the worst of the worst things, right? The headlines that you read and you just cringe. And I can sit down and talk to them and they're a human being. And so
This
how do
sounds
we
remarkable to me. I mean, you say it's not, it's unremarkable. This sounds remarkable. Okay.
Yes. I mean, it was amazing work. I think it set the trajectory for the rest of my entire academic career. Certainly, I still go back to sort of those years I spent just talking to these men on Rikers Island. Um, so I did that for about 3 years until New York got rid of the death penalty. And so our office was shut down, and I decided I did not want to work with people facing the death penalty anymore. I wanted to actually try to prevent those crimes from occurring in the first place.
Before we move on to your next research, that's
Mhm.
really fascinating, and I want to talk about. Before we go on, I had a question queued up to ask you about your work for New York City, and I think you kind of answered it. You use the phrase every time and then follow that with a couple of explanations. Horrific lives. It seems like you did find, I was going to ask, did you find a common theme? And it seems like you did.
We did. So we had this saying in that office, which was the worse the crime, the worse the story, right? So and it was always true. You were always uncovering, like people don't just do horrific things out of absolutely nowhere. There is a path that gets them there. And it often involves their own kind of early childhood violence and victimization, which is not an excuse, right? And it doesn't mean you're not responsible. It's just, how do we understand what that pathway looks like? Because you're not born into the world, this little evil baby ready to commit murder, right? It's
Yeah.
has developed over time, and you could see exactly how it was developed. You could also go back and see all these places that it could have gone differently, right? Like if only their sixth grade teacher had noticed this, or if only somebody had intervened at 14, or if only this, you could see where the story had turned out differently. It's like when it got to the point of committing that murder, there was just so many failures along that pathway that you could see that prevention was absolutely possible.
Are you putting this together as a composite of the death row inmate story with everyone else's added together? Because that specific story could be colored, right?
Right. Yes. I worked, probably had my hands in maybe 20 to 25 cases. So I was working with a lot of different, all men. I never worked with a woman. At various stages. Some were on death row. Most of them were awaiting sentencing at Rikers. So this was not a formal study, right? At that point, I had
Yeah.
not gone to graduate school. I didn't
Yeah.
know any of the terminology to really study this. This was just my own experience doing this
You're
work.
just taking it in. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, wow. So let's talk about your next research. Now you're working, you receive a 3-year grant and were a principal investigator for the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice. Tell us about that, please.
Yes, that project started with me and my co-author James Densley and a group of kind of passionate undergraduate students sitting around a conference table thinking about mass shootings. And it was, we were having a lot of mass shootings. It was right around the Las Vegas mass shooting.
Oh, yeah.
And there was all this conversation about, mental illness and mass shootings, mental illness and violence had been a focus of mine through graduate school. And so I started Googling just, what percentage of mass shooters had a diagnosable mental illness, or what percent of them had experienced this. And it was clear that this was a group of people that we did not understand. There was just no actual data. We could find kind of counts of how often they were happening, but I couldn't find any information about who these perpetrators were and what their lives were like leading up to the shooting. So we decided we were gonna try to look into it.
You mean you couldn't find the information in one place? Because I'm sure each court case has separate information, right?
Exactly. I
Okay.
couldn't find, right, a collection of that information that you could actually draw conclusions about patterns and things. It was
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
kind of case studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we basically decided to pull all those case studies together into one place, right? So we made a spreadsheet. Every perpetrator who had killed 4 or more people going back about 50 years. We initially started by coding them on maybe 40 or 50 different variables. And then we got the grant from the National Institute of Justice. Once we got that, we really expanded the database. So it's now up to about 200 different variables that each perpetrator is coded on, and it's about 200 perpetrators. So anything, from early childhood trauma, violent video games, mental health treatment, warning signs, leakage, how they got their guns. And as we were coding, we would end up adding more variables. And we initially released that database, maybe 3 years ago. And it's kind of this living, breathing document. So we're now in its 8th iteration because people download it, they use it, and then they come back and they suggest to us variables that we're missing, or, an FBI report comes out and we can go back and sort of code some perpetrator with more detail. So we're sort of constantly changing it. The other thing that the NIJ grant let us do was interviews. So we sent a letter to every living perpetrator of a mass shooting that we could find. Most of them die when they do the shooting, so that we could only find about 35 of them. 7 of them wrote back and said they would agree to be interviewed about their life history. So we interviewed perpetrators. We also interviewed moms and dads of perpetrators, siblings, kind of childhood teachers, basically very similar to the investigative work I did back for New York, but we decided to do it just looking at mass shooters in a more academic capacity.
First, a point of clarification for me. You were talking about variables and you used the word leakage. I don't know what that word means in the context of your work.
Good question. Yes. So leakage means anytime somebody says they're going to do a mass shooting or some sort of violence before they do it.
Oh, I see. So they're kind of
their plans.
Innuendo, suggestions. I got it. Yeah. So have you found anything similar in these variables between mass shooters and the people on death row back in New York City, New York State?
A good question. I haven't been asked that one before. Yes, certainly. In terms, I think about the early childhood trauma stuff, the kind of really horrific 0 to 5 experiences, a lot of physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental suicide, pretty significant early childhood stuff. I would say that's consistent. These crimes, mass shootings, are a little bit different because they're so performative. They're meant to be watched. They're meant to be witnessed. They're a way to kind of get your message out to the world. A lot of the crimes that I worked with back in New York were more impulsive, less planned out. These are very planned. These are also suicides. Mass shootings are suicides in addition to being homicides. And so that also gives them kind of a slightly, different trajectory. So I would say there was some similarities, but really mass shooters were very similar to each other and kind of different than other murderers and criminals that I had worked with and studied previously.
It seems like they almost didn't care if they got away with it.
Well, actually, they go in intending to die they have to, because part of the goal is they want their name in the history books for this. They want their message out. So nobody does it and throws on a disguise and races for the border, right? They go in knowing, I want to be known for this.
Wow. So after having done this, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, but I'm just wondering at this point have you been able to pinpoint through this first 40 variables, then 50, now it's gone all the way to 200 variables. Have you been able to pick several variables or a point to say, this is what triggers a person to become from being super angry to become a mass shooter? Is there something there?
I mean, yes and no. So a lot of those variables were kind of ruling out explanations, right? So for a while, it was all about violent video games. We went and coded how many perpetrators play violent video games. It's not that many, right? For a while, last summer, it was SSRI.
Thank God I'm normal.
Yes, last summer, it was SSRI medication specifically was in the news. We went and coded how many perpetrators took SSRI medication. It's similar to the normal population. You don't see a lot of it. And so a lot of it was just kind of ruling out these explanations that would come up every time there was one case. So I would say I can't give you sort of a checklist of here's the checklist that makes you a mass shooter, but we did find what we call kind of a common pathway to violence that perpetrators went down. And that was kind of starting with early childhood trauma, developing into a really clear crisis point where people were noticing that something was wrong, their behavior was off. That was something kind of tipped the scale. It was a job loss or a breakup.
Dr. Peterson, when you say people noticing,
Yeah.
Is this more than just mom and dad? Does this
Yeah.
include like teachers, the immediate community?
Yep. Teachers, coworkers,
Okay.
friends, random people online are noticed. Like there's a marked change in their behavior.
Okay.
Um, that crisis is suicidal. So they don't care if they live or die anymore. They start studying other perpetrators. Many of them spend time in online chat groups. Many of them identify with the previous perpetrators who came before them, kind of see themselves in them and want to be a part of that group in some way.
Of all the heroes they can pick?
I know, I know, but there is that element of it.
Wow.
One sister of a perpetrator described it really eloquently, where she said her brother went from saying, what's wrong with me, to saying what's wrong with everybody else and whose fault is it, right? It's like it's the initial piece of it is this
Oh.
self-loathing, but then it becomes this has to be someone's fault. So whose fault is it? And so school shooters blame the kids at their school, workplace shooters blame their colleagues, some people blame racial groups or women or religious groups. They pick a group that kind of represents their grievance with the world. And then the shooting is a way to make everybody see and witness that grievance. It's a way to be seen and known in a way that they aren't in their life. And of course they also have access to the weapons that they need to carry it out.
That's an important point that we're going to talk about. I'm really fascinated with that. And I'm wondering, is your research with your students at Hamline University, where you're executive director of the Violence Prevention Project research, is that data adding on, enhancing this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So currently, yeah, the database is housed there. It's free to download. It's fully available to the public. It's been downloaded thousands of times by researchers and policymakers
Wait,
and
is this the same data from what you were describing from DOJ, or is this a separate research with your
this
students?
is same data.
Okay.
So just kind of still growing and expanding it on the life histories of mass shooters.
Is it being expanded by, unfortunately, new mass shooting events, or are they also bringing new variables? You said it went from 40 to 50 to 200, and now you go back and add those variables to prior mass shooting events. Is that also happening?
Yes, exactly. So we're still adding new variables. I thought at some point we would hit a maximum, but we are still adding new variables. We are still going back and updating information from old shootings. And unfortunately, we're still fairly regularly having to add new cases to the data, which is
Unfortunately.
important because we can look and see kind of over time, in the past 5 years, has anything changed? And so we do keep it updated in that way to look for trends.
And I'm going to ask this question. It probably comes from the fact that I watch too much CNBC. Do you do sort of an AI analysis of all this data? Like, is that not relevant to this to see if
We
there's a trend?
we haven't. We're just doing, old school statistics.
Which is fine. No, I was just wondering because you hear that in business news all
Yeah.
the time. AI this, AI that. Okay. Um, One of the things that I noticed in preparing for my conversation with you is some of this research that you're conducting, Dr. Peterson, goes back to 1966. Why then?
We picked 1966 because that is the year of the Texas bell tower shooting. It was at the
Oh,
University of Texas. It was kind of known as the first modern day mass shooting because it ended up being live streamed on television at the time. And so it's kind of pointed to as kind of the one where the mass shooting was born. They existed before then, but not in the public eye in the same way.
I see. I see. Um, Before we go to the next segment, I just have a quick question, a bit personal, but I think our audience and I are both dying to know. Going back to New York City, you leave a prison or you leave speaking to a person on death row or even mass shooters later. What do you talk about at night when you're getting together with your friends? I think that's it's not just about you.
Yeah.
That's a real important question about our
Yeah.
society. I used to be a patent lawyer. So at nights I would talk about patent cases and my friends would say, Adele, for crying out loud, that is so boring. Stop. right? And then my friend who was a DA, she had stories, and her stories were always interesting to listen to.
Yes.
So, did this sort of pervade through your personality for some time?
Back in New York, it did. I think it was so all encompassing. I was,
Yeah.
100 hours a week. I was fascinated. It was, so certainly I was pretty immersed in it. I'm sure my friends were bored of my stories.
I
Um,
doubt it.
now it's different. Now I have three kids who I cannot talk about mass shootings at the dinner table every night. So there's a little bit more, I would say, of a healthy separation in that way now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Did it get you depressed?
It didn't. I think, I don't know, there's something about being exposed to really the darkest side of humanity and realizing it's not as dark as you thought it was. That's
Oh,
actually
wow.
kind of the opposite. It's just, there's still human people, there's still good in them. I think the hardest interviews for me is when we were interviewing victims, specifically parents who had lost children. Those are really overwhelming interviews to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Oh boy, yeah.
those I feel like I could feel really heavy for a while. But in general, talking to perpetrators did not make me depressed. It actually made me hopeful. I actually feel like I wish more people could see the human side of sort of this darkness because it's less scary.
And what went wrong?
Yes, exactly.
I asked that question because I see that let's not talk about other countries. We Americans sort of hurl ourselves from one mass shooting to another, and we forget. So the fact that you were so proximate to it for at least 3 years that I know, it's
Mhm.
really interesting. We'll be back after a short break to talk about other research about mass shooters.